In the next 3 videos, I'll cover Omnisphere's arpeggiator functions. Let's dive in. We're looking at Omnisphere's main page. In the lower right corner, we see the arpeggiator switch. The bright blue color indicates the arpeggiator is turned on. Let me turn off my sequencer and play a single note on my MIDI controller. With the arpeggiator active, any MIDI input causes Omnisphere to generate a rhythmical pattern. Turn it off, no rhythm. Now this particular sound has a delay effect that may confuse things a little. So we'll go to our Effects tab for Layer A and turn that off. Back in our main page, you'll see our downward pointing arrow next to the arpeggiator button. This is a preset selector. Let's choose another preset. Here's a different pattern. Now I'll play a chord rather than a single note, and we'll see that the arpeggiator responds specifically to your MIDI input, unlike a simple drum machine. Let's go to the ARP button at the top. This takes us to the arpeggiator editor. Click on the power button to turn it on or off. We have the downward arrow here, another place to access the preset selector. We also have copy and paste functionality, allowing you to move arpeggiator settings from one patch to another within a multi, and a save preset functionality as well. This is like many other functions in Omnisphere. You can save your arpeggiator settings for use later on in other projects. The file path is indicated here in your settings library. Note that I created a custom folder manually to contain my presets. Let's load in a blank starting point and build up an arpeggiator pattern from scratch so we can look at the basics. In our pattern programming area, we can engage individual steps with the power switches. We can determine the length of the pattern with the thin blue line at the bottom. Here I've got the pattern length set to 8 subdivisions. As I click on new power switches, those slots get filled with an event. I can click and drag directly within the programming area, and new events are generated. The total length of my pattern automatically gets extended. If I double-click on a power switch for a particular event, it becomes tied to the prior event as a single longer event. Each event's velocity can be adjusted by dragging the blue bar up or down. The length of individual events is adjusted by holding the Shift key down and grabbing the right edge of each blue bar. So, we can adjust note velocities, note lengths, we can create new events, turn events on and off, tie events together, and adjust the overall pattern length. In a later video, we'll cover the modes and the trigger patterns, but we see here under the clock pattern that we're working with a 16th note subdivision. Let me just change those to 8th notes. The 2 knobs and the slider on the upper right affect all the events in the pattern. The length knob will globally scale the length of all individual events while keeping their relative lengths intact. So I'm going to switch this back to a 16th note pattern. Bring the length back up a little bit and go over to our swing knob. As I bring the knob up from 0, I get an increasingly swung 16th note feel and back to 0 for a straight feel. This is accomplished by delaying every second or even numbered event in the pattern. The velocity slider determines whether the notes respond to the note velocities as I played them, in this case very quietly, or to respond to the note velocities as programmed in your arpeggiated pattern. It can be very musically useful to use a combination of both. Have the arpeggiator provide the primary accents, and have your playing determine some of the intensity of the notes. Moving the slider to the midpoint will give you the best of both worlds. In this video, we'll get into some more of the details of working with the arpeggiator. I'll look at mode and trigger settings shortly. Currently, we're working in chord mode. Our trigger setting is set to legato. Let's see how that works, and we'll look at an interesting interaction between the length of notes and the swing setting. With these settings, if I play a chord on the keyboard, I'll hear that chord repeat every 16th note. The pattern contains 32 steps, so my entire pattern is 2 measures in length. Now as I bring up the swing slider, something funny happens. Many of the note attacks are obscured. That's because swing works by delaying every other event, and it ends up pushing the ends of those note events into the beginnings of the following events. The problem is solved by pulling back on the length of all events, so they don't extend over one another. Here's the problem again when swing is extended. I'll solve the problem by shortening all events again. So with certain types of synth patches, you have to watch out for this interaction between length and swing. Up till now, we've been working in chord mode. We know that every time we play a chord on the keyboard, that entire chord is reproduced through each event in this arpeggiated pattern, 32 events over 2 measures. Let's look at our triggers. We've been working in legato trigger setting. In this mode, the first note starts the pattern in step 1, and additional legato notes do not restart the pattern. Any new separated notes restart the pattern from step 1. If we go to a trigger setting of note, the pattern always resets to step 1 whenever a new note is played. This is regardless of whether notes are still being held, played legato, or played in a separated manner. And here's legato mode again. So let's take a look at the last trigger setting, song position. For song position, I'm going to bring over this counter because this mode is especially useful when working with your sequencer. I'll start by setting a loop of 4 measures for measures 1 through 5 in my host sequencer. When it rolls around to measure 1 again, I'll play a single note as close to the downbeat of the first measure as I can. The pattern begins on the first step. Next, I'll play another note, but this time at measure 2 instead of at measure 1. The arpeggiator picked up at step 17, right in the middle of the pattern. Omnisphere keeps track of the relationship between the 2-measure pattern and the odd and even bar numbers in my host sequencer. Measures 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on will always correspond to the first step in the pattern. But there's one very important thing to keep in mind. Timing is relative even in song position trigger mode, so if you play a note late relative to the grid, all steps will play late for the duration of that sustained note or chord. Now let's take a look at the octave switches. These are pretty self-explanatory. Any notes that you play will be arpeggiated over a span of 1, 2, 3, or 4 octaves. So we'll leave it at 2 octaves and switch modes. Let's go to up mode. Here's a 3-note chord. With a 1-octave range, the notes play over and over again in an upward fashion. Let's try a 4-note chord. A simpler pattern of 4 notes per repetition. As you might guess, you'll see the same behavior in down mode with 3 and 4-note chords. Let's check out up-down mode. Here I'll play a 3-note chord. This generates 4 16th notes per repetition, a simpler pattern. Now up-down plus mode is fantastic for 4-note chords when you want to maintain the simple 16th note repetition. It does this by repeating both the top and the bottom notes on each pass up and down. And of course, down up plus exhibits the same type of behavior. Let's move to random mode, one of my favorites. Play a chord. The notes are triggered in different orders with each repetition. And if you spread it out over multiple octaves, you get that wacky, cool, randomized, arpeggiated pattern that I love so much. Now in as played mode, Omnisphere remembers the order with which you played multiple notes in a chord and continues to arpeggiate them in that order. There's a low note, high note, mid-low note, and mid-high note in the chord. That pattern is repeated over and over for as long as this particular chord is held down. The last 2 modes are repeat times 2 and repeat times 4. In repeat times 2, every alternate step is actually ignored, and we only hear the velocity settings for every odd-numbered step, simply repeated twice. The same is true with repeat times 4 mode. Okay, the last item on our agenda is the reset button. You can press this button with the mouse, or as we'll see later, with MIDI controllers. Whenever it's activated, it forces the arpeggiator back to step 1, regardless of your trigger setting. This includes a song position setting for the duration of any sustained note or chord. So, let's meet again soon, and we can take a look at the arpeggiator's groove lock function. Now that we know how to get around the arpeggiator, we can dive into the groove lock functionality, as well as other ways that we can make the arpeggiator rock with your rhythm tracks. Well, there's a very simple starting point. We're working with random mode over a 2-octave range with 16 steps, all set to velocity of 127. Now let's listen to this pattern playing back along with the sequence against the tambourine in the drum loop. It's important to note that I quantize the sustaining notes triggering the arpeggiator. This ensures that my arpeggiator pattern locks with my sequencer tracks. Let's see what we've got. So now let's go to this groove lock function and see how it can help us out. If we click on the area at the bottom of the arpeggiator, we can open up a dialog box to import either a standard MIDI file or a Stylus RMX file. The standard MIDI file that I'm importing contains the exact note timing information contained within the drum loop that we're listening to. The blue dots now represent the timing of the notes that are actually being played, overriding the straight grid. So now the arpeggiator is completely following the timing of the drum groove. The strength slider allows us to move the timing back towards or all the way to the ideal grid. With strength at 0, we're back to where we started. Bringing up the strength slider just part of the way, we can incorporate some of the drum groove timing without going all the way there. This can often be very useful in a musical context. Well, let's be honest here. It still doesn't really sound all that good. How can we make it better? Well, one of the most important components of any groove are the accents, the dynamics. Here I'm loading an arpeggiator preset I've created where I've incorporated the velocities or dynamic feel from the drum groove by manually adjusting the 16 steps. Now this is a totally straight timing. Now that's much more happening, and it doesn't even include the timing information yet. But it definitely locks pretty nicely with the drum groove because of the similar accents that I've incorporated. So if matching accents can help and matching timing can help, what happens when you do both together? Here I've imported the MIDI file with the timing and manually adjusted velocities. Let's see what that sounds like. Don't forget to play around with the strength parameter as you audition these. Now let's bring in a final element. We'll go to the FX page for this one-layer patch, and we'll turn on a delay effect. Now we're getting somewhere. Don't forget, when you use song position triggers, make sure your note placements are tight where the notes can drift when sustained. Use Groove Lock to import MIDI files and precisely duplicate their timing in your pattern. Use the strength slider to incorporate less or more of the MIDI file's timing. Manually adjust velocities to really shape your accents and grooves. Add a tasteful delay and pull the listener into your world.